Tech Cocktail Sessions, educational and inspirational talks from experienced startup founders, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders.
Thank you. Good to be here. I guess I could fall off this stage and make sure everybody knows about this event. Hopefully I won't. I know we have 20 minutes of questions and answers at the end, and I'll since the mission today or mandate was to talk about inspiration and ideas, and that's something I do think about a lot. I want to go through some of the ideas I've had and the things I've done to try to make those real, and but very happy in the Q&A to get really into the specifics of fundraising or whatever particular issues you have. But I wanted to start and really try to weave together some themes that I think have really inspired me and motivated me as an entrepreneur. And some of those themes really include sort of this what we can clearly see now is sort of digitization of places and people and things. Everything in the analog world obviously not only has a digital equivalent now, but it has many digital equivalents, and that's a process I've sort of been in the middle of for a while. I'm also fascinated about how technology creates disruptive moments, and sometimes just for the sake of disruption, and seeing sort of at that moment as you get to know a technology and get to know a particular problem really well, where that can lead. And I want to talk a little bit about that. But I sort of have a little bit, I guess being in DC, this won't seem so weird, but I think outside of DC it is kind of strange that, I'm here in DC in part because of a passion I had for foreign policy, international conflict, and sort of spent the first part of my career in DC working at a think tank called the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I studied in college and did history and poli-sci, which my dad was, certain was going to lead to absolutely nothing. And in fact, I got a paid fellowship out of college. That was great. And I want to go back one step even further because these things really link together. As I was trying to understand, and this is difficult sometimes to explain how you have an idea like we had for personal. And people are like, how did you think of it? And it's just not a simple answer. And I'd like to try to just go on a quick, tour of kind of how we got to personal and a couple things, because as I prepared for this and was really thinking about it, I realized there were some connections and some things that were kind of fun to share. I think sort of my journey started in many ways when I was in high school and had a government teacher who was very passionate about the world, making the world better. I was a big public high school in Florida, not exactly the epicenter of activism and in changing the world. But I actually one summer saw, or maybe it was before the summer, saw an ad in Time magazine, the print version, that was about coming to Washington to do it's called the Presidential Classroom for Young Americans. I was like, wow, I've never been to Washington. I'd love to do that. So I cut it out, returned it. They sent me an application in print, two weeks later, and I filled it out and sent it back. So I got accepted to come up here, which I think basically everyone who was willing to write a check did. And they had this little checkbox that said, if you, we've identified you as someone who we might want to take with us to Europe for a 3-week program, which costs even more. But we're going to take you to London and UK and then Belgium. And the last piece really caught my attention because this was 1987 to East Germany. And I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. And I'd never been to Europe. So I applied, and it turned out that was a little more competitive, and I think they took 30 students. And so here I was, sort of summer before senior year of high school, in Europe for the first time, and ended up in West Berlin first, and for a few days before going to East Berlin. And somebody was killed when I was there, trying to escape. I didn't see it, but it was like big news. And there was a lot of marching in the streets, so it was a real powerful moment. And some friends that I was there with, or people I just met, we decided to walk into the zone in the wall that you're not supposed to go, and we did, and they yelled at us from like a big tower, and we got back really quickly. And I was quickly informed that wasn't funny, and we should absolutely not do that again. And like the next day, we went with a guided tour from the U.S. military actually into East Berlin, and it was just really a life-changing experience to see. As some of you I'm sure have heard about, maybe some have experienced, the guns pointed the opposite direction. They weren't pointed at the Westerners in West Berlin. They were pointed at their own people, the tanks, the dogs, everybody just looking totally dour. And we spent, the good part of the day walking around, again, under strict instructions, like not to go to certain places, definitely not to talk to anyone. And at one point during the day, ended up deciding to try to make a conversation in a department store. And within seconds, a guy with a gun right there in my face, pointing a gun at me, took my passport, and I stood there absolutely realizing I'm could be a diplomatic incident here, and I was already told there's really nothing we can do if you screw up. And I thought maybe that was it. And thankfully, he gave it right back. I ran to the bus. But it was sort of one of my first experiences of being surveilled. And so I left, and when I remember taking off on the plane and being able to leave and thinking, my God, I'm going to commit myself to like changing this. This was such a profound experience to sort of see these people living this way. And then quickly moving ahead, that fall, I ran for student council president in Jacksonville, and you'll see how this ties together, so stay with me. You're like, well, we're here for startup, not to learn about politics. But I even ran for the student council thing for the whole city in Jacksonville, Florida, like 22 high schools, and got it. And in our second meeting or third meeting, the superintendent of schools came in and said, guess what? President Reagan's coming to Jacksonville, where did I live? And he's going to give his pre-summit address with Mikhail Gorbachev to talk about, you know, communism and all of this stuff that's going on. And we're going to let 3 of you guys sit on stage with him. And I'm just sitting there going, wow, I've done all of this work. I've gotten here. Like, everything in my life is coming together. And I wasn't picked. And I was literally, and it was very, and I heard Herb saying, if you're still around, I love you. You taught me a lot, but that wasn't cool. We were really challenging him on a lot of stuff. And clearly my first example of not getting something that I thought I'd worked hard to deserve, certainly unexpected. And I left really disappointed because I wasn't going to have this opportunity. And I told my government teacher about it. And she told me, you know, you didn't hear it from me, but the principal of the junior high, his wife is actually like running point with the White House on this whole trip. And you should tell her what happened and how unjust you think it is. And I never meant, and I went and I stormed in. I said, you know, I just want you to know this is unjust. I find out a day later, they called and said, we're thinking of having some students ask President Reagan a question, and maybe we could make it up to you by letting you ask him a question. And I was like, you know, sure, I'll take that. That works. And I ended up asking him a question about Mikhail Gorbachev that became the first time President Reagan spoke publicly about his relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev. And it became a 3-day event in the news, as the news said that he had sidestepped my question by talking about how popular, how he had this line that he was not worried about Mikhail Gorbachev's popularity because he had co-starred with Errol Flynn in the movies. But the point of it was, I sat there as a public high school, Jacksonville, Florida, 4 or 5 months after being in Berlin, watching Peter Jennings and Ronald Reagan in the White House debate the question I had asked 3 days earlier. It was really phenomenal. And that was the moment I told my dad I was not, in fact, going to go do business or be an entrepreneur. I was going to go do politics and history. So here I am, Dad, you know, doing finally what you wanted. And went to Michigan, did that, and ended up at the Carnegie Endowment, as I told you. And in my first couple years there, Bosnia was happening, Rwanda happened. We were very engaged in those things. I was right in the middle of all these, you know, important people working on it. And I'll never forget, because it was not obviously a very successful effort by those of us who cared a lot about those issues, ended up being called into a meeting by some of the powers that be at the Carnegie Endowment and elsewhere. And they said, you know, the system we have today isn't working, and we want to create a new organization called the International Crisis Group. I don't think they had the name then, but they had the idea. And they're like, we just want you to take notes. Like, we need you to take notes for this meeting. And I'm sitting in this room, and like Robert McNamara, who I didn't even realize was still alive, is like sitting there and debating this with other people and what to do. And the heart of it was just helping the international community understand what was happening and come up with real actionable plans fast, like in real time, and make sure that the elite of the elite knew what the plan should be and help speed the reaction. And over the next 18 months, I was part of a team, a very small team, that wrote the business plan for the International Crisis Group, helped get it funded, helped recruit the original staff, and then set up the original board meetings. It was my first real startup experience, and had nothing to do with, you know, with business, but I was just fascinated that you could take an idea and get it funded and then see something real happen. And I think today ICG has about 200 people in Brussels doing some of the best work, I think, in this space. And so just then when you're thinking, okay, straight path right into foreign policy career, I was presented with an opportunity to help a scientist who was working at a national lab on issues related to finding landmines, which I'd been in Bosnia, I'd seen the landmines, I'd been near them. And I just was like, you know, the ability to take technology and solve a problem like that was so interesting to me. And I realized then that my passion really wasn't just about foreign policy. It was really the whole area of solving problems that made people's lives better, et cetera. And knowing nothing about technology, knowing nothing really about business, postponed a graduate career to do a PhD in government to start this company. And it didn't actually have a great exit. One former investor is actually in the room. I won't call him out. It had a good exit, but it took a long time to develop this technology. And the key there is I actually, not being the real scientist or coder in the room, but helping write the business plan, got it funded, got the right people working on it. I had a chance to really work pretty deeply around, this is sort of 1997, 8, early 99, with some supercomputers that had some of the best mapping on it, and stuff that just, even to this day, some of that's just better than anything you've still seen. It was brilliant. And I got familiar with it. And when I had my sort of mini exit in 99, decided to go to business school in Barcelona, where the University of Chicago actually had a campus, and kind of hang out for a little time, learn Spanish. I was there, and what I instantly saw is everyone had these mobile phones, not just to talk, but they were getting information and news and weather, and they were texting constantly. And it just started to become clear to me that the mapping I had seen was going to end up on those devices. And Barcelona is a very complicated city. I was always lost. And I was thinking, God, I would love to be able to get around on this. And someone I'd met through my Bosnia experience, who had been thinking separately about mapping and about how maps could be a new media form and have advertising on them, came to me and said, I have this idea about mapping. What do you think? And I was like, well, I've been thinking about the digital side of it, and I just think this whole world is about to just get digitized, and everything is going to be digital around us, and we're going to explore the world through this device. And so again, knowing nothing about the technology we were going to use, not really clear on the business model, I dropped out of business school. My friend quit his job, and we hired one guy who was 21 years old. He's still the CTO of Personal to this day, and gave him a little bit of money and said, see what we can do in 60 days. And to his credit, he came back under budget and ahead of schedule with some of the most interesting looking maps I'd ever seen that were digital with these beautiful overlays. We were using Macromedia Flash back then. And we realized then, we're like, we can do this. We're going to build a multi-platform mapping system that's going to have the best presentation and content ever. And we started building it, and we were self-funding. And of course, in 2000, the entire market's just starting to crash around us. But we were able to get a great paying customer, Condé Nast, and they were launching an online site called concierge.com. And we were building all their online maps, and we're even doing a set of print maps that were going to be supported by advertising in the travel industry. We opened an office right across the street from the World Trade Center. We started to sell advertising out of there. Interestingly, the first advertiser on the front of that map was Nokia, who ended up being the company that I ended up working. These are fun ironies. And literally 2 weeks before we were going to really launch this product in the biggest way was 9/11. And our main office was here in DC at the Map Network, and we had already done some event mapping. We'd done the inauguration here locally and some things just to prove that these maps could have rich event information overlays. And sort of 24 hours after 9/11, we were sitting there trying ourselves to make sense of what was happening because we couldn't get in the building in New York. Everything was closed around it. And as we were reading all the news on where the roads were open and closed and where the water was on and off, or the electricity, where the relief shelters were, the blood donation centers, we just decided, it was so clear to us, well, we're just going to, instead of taking, using this great map with all these visual layers to put hotel information or restaurant information or bar information, we're just going to start putting that stuff in there. And we did it for a day, and it just started helping us make sense of everything. And we realized that dozens and then hundreds of different pieces of news items were visible in a single picture. And as we did that, we decided, a friend of mine was actually working for the former FEMA director. We called her up and said, hey, we just want you to see this and see what we've done. And he gave us a name at FEMA. We called the guy up and said, hey, if this is helpful, we'd just love you to see it. And the guy's like, hey, great, whatever. And about an hour later, our CTO, Tarek, says, you got to come see this. And we went over, and on the front page of FEMA was our map. And it said, for the International Interactive Relief and Rescue Map, look at the information here. And we're like, my God, like, we've just been pulling this stuff out of news articles, and we were on the front page of FEMA. And over the next 2 months, we became the most used map of 9/11. Kept all of the information updated, sometimes hourly, in terms of what was changing. Rescue and first responder, not first responders, but the people in the next wave were all using it. And what was fascinating at that moment, we're thinking, this is a tragedy, but we've sort of made something happen here. All of our investors sort of lost interest in the company because they were investing in a travel-oriented, advertising-supported business. And so I won't go through all the drama of that. We're happy to talk more about it. But speeding up some, we realized as we then turned towards the event world, more traditional events, Super Bowl was our biggest customer, that we had created this platform that really was about putting the tools in the hands of places and event organizers and people who knew things that no one else knew, and making amateurs into professional map makers. And we kept working on the tools and the platform to literally help people create maps that previously only experts would have been able to do. And I think one of the best sort of compliments we ever got was at a mapping conference. Sort of one of the main guys at the biggest GIS company said, it's clear you guys aren't out of the mapping industry, because if you were, we would have taught you not to do it this way. And I thought that, again, was a great moment where we just sort of followed what, from the very beginning, sort of our own thinking around this, and ended up in this sort of fun new place. So the company was acquired by Navtech, which was sort of they had driven roads for 20 years, building the best road map database of the world. And one of the things that we learned as we were sort of being integrated there was we had learned that places, when we were giving them the tools to map themselves, that they actually wanted to own the data. It was so clear to them. I mean, the convention center here in town is like a great example client. The Smithsonian was another. The digital versions of their buildings were clearly just an extension of the real building. And when we were negotiating with them in the earliest of days about how we could have rights to redistribute that data to other interactive maps and sell advertising on it in some cases, they were like, look, we own the map data. I mean, it was a non-negotiable issue. They're like, it's our building, it's our map. We'll be happy to use your tools. We're happy to pay you even for that, and happy to give you some redistribution rights, but we want to own the data, and we want to control what data ever leaves the building, if no pun intended. Turned out that over 90% of the data they were creating was not ever allowed, we were never allowed to publish it or distribute it, because it was used within the walls of that building or within the world that, of a closed world of the people who lived, worked, managed stuff within the building. And so this was a big challenging idea for Navtech, where they had driven the roads for 20 years at their cost and their expense, and they owned that map data, and that's what they sold every day. And so just as we were working through this issue and kind of really, I won't get into all the details now, not that you'll ever want to hear them, but they were not very fun. I find out that Nokia is buying Navtech. And for me, I didn't know if Nokia, I thought they were based in Europe, but someone told me that morning they were in Japan, and I believed it for like 20 minutes. Knew nothing about this company, and all I know is when I watch the press conference, the CEO of Nokia spends half the press conference talking about the mapping of places and how the mobile device is going to be the future of how everyone's going to interact with the world around them. And I got all these emails, and they're like, you either have the best job in the company or the worst. And it was somewhere towards the latter in terms of needing to integrate with this big beast that was Navtech, with Nokia. That said, I love the people at Nokia, and we were in the middle of working on that integration when we were invited to come look and talk to them about all of the consumer data that they were collecting that comes off the device and their different operations. And in the course of that, the first thing that really struck me was the size of their user base, 1.2 billion people. And at that point, basically 1 out of 3 people in the world with a mobile device had a Nokia device. Actually more, it's actually almost 40% at one point. And the second thing that really struck me was just how personal the data was that was coming off the device. And I just had my first daughter, and it was entirely clear to me that next generation of capturing this data, that it needed to change. And the final piece, for trying to weaving this all together, was their office for doing this and looking at this was in what used to be East Berlin. And it was one of the first times I'd been back, and I was sitting there thinking, literally 8 blocks from the former Stasi headquarters, that God, if 20 years ago I could have walked down there and said, I have an idea on how you can capture real-time data on 1.2 billion people and know everywhere they are, what they're reading, who they're talking to, what they care about, how much money, all the kind of data that clearly can be captured today. I just thought of how different the world might have been, and for me that was very clear. And so back to that moment when we decided, my whole team and I, to leave and start Personal, it was so clear to us, given our experience in the mapping industry with the building needing to own the data, and clear that people were now being mapped and tracked and basically being digitized, but not as a participant, that the same thing we had seen work in the mapping space, where you put the tools and the legal controls and the technical controls in the hands of a place to build and manage and leverage this data, just applied perfectly to people. And that's what Personal is about. I'm happy to spend more time talking about Personal. It's it is the world's first digital data vault with a whole robust set of permissions on it. And our thinking is that the competitive advantage to collect, aggregate, and leverage and permission data about people is with each and every one of us, and that's what we're doing now. We have a bunch of great use cases I'd love to tell you about if you have interest. We've launched in beta in November, and we have a great form-filling app that is really pretty magical coming out very soon. And we're looking at enabling an entire ecosystem based on a privacy by design, security by design, people owning their data type of model. And our view is that the social explosion has been fantastic. We're big fans. But the social value exchange that happens where your data is owned by others, leveraged by others, and clearly available for most everyone to see, actually probably doesn't apply to about 95% of the data that's going to be in your life 5 years from now. When you think of the connected car, knowing who's getting in it based on the weight that comes in the front seat, the connected house that can tell whether a blender or a TV's been turned on by the electrical signature that comes out of that. When you're talking about each and every movement that you or your child take, I mean, we've been using Fitbit in the office. I mean, it's fascinating, but really, is someone else going to own the Fitbit data, or is that yours? I think for us, it became entirely clear a couple of years ago that when this level of connectedness, the Internet of Things, when this happens, that it's really not going to be much of a debate. I don't think anyone, I'd love to debate you if anyone wants to stand up and say that other companies should own all that data about you and you should just, be a passive participant in that. It was very clear to us that wasn't going to be the case, and I know I'm about out of time. Those are the kind of, I think, really fun moments. And I have not talked at all about how you actually go out and do these things and act on them. I've got a lot of, certainly things to share on that if you have interest. But in trying to just work backwards into how do you have the ideas, I think working hard and positioning yourself around really innovative technologies and ideas and business models and not being afraid to think about big disruptive ideas. And I really, a lot of times when we talk to people in depth about what we're trying to do at Personal, because it carries all the way through disrupting the advertising model and changing the dynamics of that, and again, I could go on for hours. People are like, God, you've thought of everything. This is incredible how deep this goes. And I said, it really wasn't so hard. We just took the current model and turned it upside down. And everywhere we look today at who is in control and who had the interest, the vested interest to make this happen, we just said, what if it was a consumer? And it just was fell out the other side, how so much of these things happen, or how it should work. And I'm just really excited about that. And again, sometimes I've said this, been quoted before it, the closer you get to Silicon Valley at times, the harder it is for them to understand what I'm talking about. And I feel like when I'm in Chicago or here in DC and tell someone, hey, you should own and control your data and leverage it for your benefit, they're like, absolutely. How do I do that? What's the next step? It's like the mindset is very different. And I think I can talk about that too more. But why don't I stop there and do Q&A and take whatever questions you guys have. Thanks.